Hey, my friends, welcome back to the Make That Money podcast. And guess what? I have an actual human guest today. Can you believe it? I am not here talking to myself. I mean, I'm talking to you, but I am not recording by myself. And I'm so excited about it because my guest is a friend and we have spent quite a bit of time together in some courses and classes and in my Make That Money course and in my Synergy. And we have become friends over time. And I have learned so much from her. And I'm so excited to announce that she is actually my first guest on Make That Money podcast. So, welcome, my friend, Michelle Cook, who is a CPA. Welcome to the podcast, my friend.
Thanks so much for having me, Nina. I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you. I know we could have gone many different directions for this podcast, but I think we've dialed in what we get asked the most. Whether you're an independent artist or you're a commissioned salon owner or a hybrid salon owner, we get asked a lot about how do I pay myself? When do I pay myself? How much do I pay myself? And then, of course, some deeper questions about S Corp, which we're going to get into a little bit later. But I know some things about you, and I want you to share some things about yourself to everyone listening. But I know that you were a hairstylist at some point in time, and then hairstylist turned into a CPA. So why don't you just kind of tell everyone a little bit about your background and your story?
Yeah, absolutely. So I in high school was part of a program where basically we could pay 500 bucks and go all the way through beauty school, which is like just an
Wow.
insane deal. Um, and so yeah, in high school I went to beauty school, got all my hours in, and then I got to the point where I was like, okay, I graduated and now what do I do? Because I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, so rent was super expensive
Mhm.
and I was real shy and I had no marketing plan and I had no clients and I just thought, I have what I'm doing. And I didn't even know that you could be an employee somewhere. Like I thought my
Mm.
only option
Oh, wow.
was to go out and rent. And so I was just like, you know what? I'm going to go to college. I'm going to go study business. And then I'm going to open up a salon once I understand how this whole thing works.
Yes.
Because I just felt like I'm 18. I don't know anything. And if there's other 18-year-olds on here listening, just know that the resources out here available today just like weren't there like back when I
Hmm.
graduated. Like there's so many amazing educators in this space. And if I had had the kind of resources that are out there today, I probably would have just gone straight for it. But I just
Yeah.
had no idea.
So so you went to college and then you went into finance, obviously, and now you're a CPA and you have this firm. And did you think to yourself though, when you started as a CPA, like I specifically want to work with the beauty industry, or did that just kind of happen organically?
Yeah. Okay. So I went and worked for just like a regular CPA firm and
Hmm.
then was there for many years. And ultimately, just like everyone else, it's like, I want to be an entrepreneur. I want to feel like I'm making a difference. I want to have like more control over my life. I think that's like why a lot of people end up wanting to go out on their own. And so
Sure.
all of that. And I literally just went to like go get a pedicure and just like started chatting with the owner. And she was like, "Hey, I actually like I need an accountant. I need
Mm.
someone." Um, and then it was just like one of those moments where it's like, of course, like the first person that I like meet after I decide to go out on my own like ends up being in the beauty industry. But it was a full circle moment for me where I was like, I understand this industry from a very different perspective than most CPAs.
Sure.
And I know that there is only so much that gets taught in beauty school, and it's not at all about money. And I
Right.
understand just that feeling of being young, inexperienced, and just not knowing where to go. And if I had even, like I said, had any kind of direction or resources, like I feel like I could have been successful in it, but I didn't.
Yeah.
And so I want to be that person for anyone else who's out there going like, I don't know how to get started. I don't know how to set myself up properly. Do I need like business bank accounts? How do I pay myself? Like where do I even go? Like I want to be able to help people when they're like feeling vulnerable and unsure and also maybe even a little bit like embarrassed to ask because for some reason people think that they should know these things, even though no one ever taught it to them. We
Right.
also inherently feel like we should just like know it automatically, which isn't the case.
I know. And I love that because you work with beauty industry professionals, and I know you work with a lot of my Make That Money students, Synergy students, even my own coaching clients. And the reports that you develop and that you share with them and everything that is broken down for them, it's so easy to read and understand where you are and how much money you're making. And you really give a lot of guidance. And I think that's what we need. And you're right. Like when I owned my salon, I did not know any of this. People, my CPA, thankfully I found a really good CPA that understood my industry, our industry. She started talking about S corp and she started talking about all these filings, and I'm like, I have no freaking clue. Like there were times where I would just get so beside myself in her office. Like I don't understand what this means. I don't know how to allocate this. How do what do you mean that's supposed to go here? I had no, like it's very frustrating. And I think that's why it's important to make sure that you find a CPA that understands our business, like you, Michelle, that really does get it, because it's very intricate and it's different. And I think that we just need that guidance. And in one of the areas more particularly is how do you pay yourself? Like that is a question that I get, especially in Make That Money. It's like, how do I pay myself? How much do I pay myself? What does this even look like? How do I know I have enough money to pay myself? So let me just kind of break this down into a couple parts. When 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 should a independent artist or a commissioned salon, or when should they start to pay themselves? Like, what does that look like? What kind of metrics should they be looking at?
Yeah. Nina, you said something so interesting to me, which was like, I found a CPA that could really explain it to me. I think a lot of people go into like a CPA relationship having expectations of what that CPA will do for them. And I think you got lucky in terms of finding that great person,
Mm-hmm.
but not every CPA is like that. Like they're just
Sure.
like, drop off your stuff. Yeah, I'll do your tax return. Here's a copy of it. See you next year kind of
Yeah.
situation. And you highlighted that you really want that extra level of care so that you can understand. You don't necessarily, you want to be compliant, you want to get things done. You also want to understand why
Mm-hmm.
and get why you're doing things. So when you're talking about when do I pay myself, this is kind of one of those things where it's like, well, let's step back and have like a deeper understanding
Mm-hmm.
of when, because it's not necessarily like once a week, twice a week, twice a month. Like my answer really comes down to, is your bookkeeping done? Because when you have finished your bookkeeping, you get something called a profit and loss statement. And on that has like your revenue, all of your expenses, but ultimately it has that profit number. So when can I pay myself? When you have a profit is the first answer, because when you're brand new in business, you might not have a profit at first. There's a lot of startup costs. It's natural to
Sure.
have some losses at first. So that's kind of my first answer is make sure that you have your numbers in place so that you know that you have a profit. And then we can then talk about the cadence of like how
Mm-hmm.
frequently and that kind of thing, which I've found for my clients, it depends in terms of some people want to get paid like weekly. And so if you want to do that, you need to determine an amount that you know that your business can consistently do in profit every single month. Because I don't care what business you are, if you pull like a profit and loss report by month, you're going to see that profit number up and down all
Mm-hmm.
throughout the year. So I would say choose whatever month is like your lowest month and then pay yourself consistently based on that so that you can have consistent income. And then at the end of the month, and honestly, probably a couple weeks after the month closes, because your bookkeeper might take a few weeks to get everything closed out, grab that profit report. And then you can say like, okay, I paid myself, I'm just going to make up numbers. Let's say there was $1,000 of profit. You paid yourself 500 already during the month. Then you can kind of look at that remaining 500 and allocate it accordingly to paying yourself versus taxes or other things.
Sure. So we have to make sure that there is money there to pay yourself. And when you do have that money there, when you do have the profit, there aren't necessarily any rules to say, well, pay yourself once a week or pay yourself every month. Or if your net profit is $5,000, you have to pay yourself 2,500. There isn't, am I right in saying like there's no rules? It's your profit, but you have to have the profit in order to do that. So looking at profit margin, making sure that there is money there. And then, so let's just say someone is making, I don't know, let's say $3,000 in net profit. Do you have a, and now this is a loaded question really, because you have to be able to look at someone's business, their profit and loss statement, the story of their business, their numbers, there's history there. But would you recommend to say someone, okay, you have $3,000 profit, pay yourself the whole thing? Or is it more of a conservative approach to that?
Yeah, I think it depends on a few things. The first thing that I want to know from someone is what are your goals? Because do you plan on growing a bunch? Are you planning on hiring a bunch of people? Are you planning on doing a remodel? Things that are going to be expensive that you need to save up for. And so if you have things that are going to like eat cash, I would say we'd want to take like a higher percentage of what that profit number is to set aside for those things. I kind of like to think of profit as like a pie, like you have a whole pie and you can kind of cut the slices in whatever way you want. And some slices are going to be bigger and some are smaller. It's, based on the needs of your specific situation as to like how you decide how big each piece is.
That makes sense. And then when they are paying themselves, because the other question is, well, how do I do it? Do I write myself a check? Do I just transfer money over? Is that then considered an owner's draw? Like, what does that actually look like when I decide, okay, I'm going to pay myself XYZ. I'm going to do it every 2 weeks because that feels good for me. How do they actually pay themselves?
Yeah. Okay. So it depends on what kind of business you own. So if you are a sole proprietorship or an LLC that has not made an S corporation election, then just like what you said, Nina, you can write yourself a check. If you have your business bank at the same bank that you have your personal account at, you can just do like a transfer really easily. I see some people, if they're at different banks, they'll just like Zelle themselves money, but you can, it's your money. You can pay yourself, as, like you said, as frequently as you want, as much as the business is able to handle. It's not necessarily like it's like in theory you could pay yourself the entire profit. Is
Mhm.
that the wisest decision to make? Probably not, because you want
Sure.
to be setting aside for other things like taxes or, just other needs of the business. But
Now, what happens when someone is paying themselves more than the profit in the business? So, this is actually a twofold question. So, paying themselves more. So, let's just say they end up in the year, and this could be due to other spend. Maybe they're spending in back bar supplies or they went over budget or what have you. But let's just say that they're paying themselves and they end up in the negative, whatever, 5, 10, 15, 20, $30,000 for the year. Do we need to make adjustments then in terms of how they're paying themselves and get them profit positive and then decide how we're going to move forward with how they're going to pay themselves for the next year?
absolutely. You bring up a point because I know I've seen a lot of stylists say, well, maybe I'll just pay myself commission because they
That was my next
logically,
question. Yes. Yep.
it logically kind
Mm-hmm.
of works out. You're like, well, I'm doing services and this is how much I can pay myself. I get why people say that from like a simplicity standpoint. I don't like that for a few reasons. One is I think you need to have the mindset of an owner,
Mm-hmm.
and an owner is not paid commission. An owner is paid based on the profits. But one is that if there is not profit, then there is no money to pay yourself. Like
Mm-hmm.
your bank account won't have the money unless you've taken out debt. And I do see that sometimes where maybe they put all of their back bar or other purchases on a credit card. So then the credit card is racking up debt, but they haven't paid off the credit card. So there is cash in the checking account,
Mm-hmm.
but so they're paying themselves from that cash and they're just letting the credit cards build up. It's a dangerous place to be in because the money's got to get paid back at some point.
Mm-hmm.
So whether you've taken out a loan. I know these square loans are real popular right now,
Mhm.
um, or credit cards. But when that happens, I honestly think a lot of stylists don't even realize that it's happening because they don't have their numbers and they're not seeing it. And they're just kind of looking in their bank account and they're saying, "Oh, I've got $3,000. My rent's due. I'm going to go pay $3,000. I'm
Right.
going to take that out and I got to go take care of myself," without actually looking at the bigger picture.
And I think you mentioned earlier the biggest component of all of this, and especially for students that are taking my Make That Money course, and even for your bookkeeping course too, they're learning how to take care of their books. The biggest issue I think that I've had when students sign up for it is they're like, holy shit, I don't have my books together, and they need that information. And that's why I think the course is so helpful. Your course, A, because it's getting their bookkeeping together, but then Make That Money just because it's forcing them to get their numbers together, and they're looking at things that they've never looked at before. They're
Mhm.
seeing markers and things that they haven't really had to look at. And it's very, very eye opening. So the first thing is make sure that your bookkeeping is together. And I think when you're running a business, and I know in the beginning, we DIY, try to DIY as much as we can because we're not making enough money or making a profit. But man, that bookkeeper, having a bookkeeper that can really balance things for you and keep you on your toes is so important. That changed my business for sure. So getting that together, number one, and then understanding that there's a difference between profit and cash flow. Because like you just mentioned, well, they're not maybe looking at their profit on paper, but then they see that there's somewhat of money in the bank account. They're already spending on their credit card. Maybe they're putting all of their product on their credit card, and that's racking up. And I'm speaking from experience because I've done all the things. Um, but I'm like, well, there's money here, but then at the end of the year or at the quarter, they start to see that they're in a deficit profit wise, and maybe even end up in a deficit in their business profit wise. But then you're right, that credit card bill needs to be paid. And when it's kind of like you're just moving money around at that point. So there is a difference between cash flow and actual profit. And then something you also mentioned was S corp. So this is another question, and we talk about this a lot. You and I have had probably, I don't know, hundreds of conversations over it, and I still DM you and I'm like, I know you've told me this 500 times, but can you please tell me one more time? Can you break down S Corp, what it means, what it looks like, and when it's time for them to even think about filing as an S Corp?
Yeah. Well, first I'll say sometimes people, when they're a sole proprietor or a single owner LLC, they'll just be like, gosh, I wish I could just pay myself a W-2 paycheck and then I could not be so confused about how to pay
Sure.
myself. And then I always want to let people know, well, you're not actually allowed to put yourself on payroll unless you own an S corporation. And then people say, okay, then let me, go make an S corporation election. And I'm like, okay, but hold off, because it costs more money to own an S corporation. There are administrative fees associated with it. And so ultimately, the point of having an S corporation is to save you in taxes. And so you need to do an analysis first, ignoring the fact that you might enjoy putting yourself on payroll and that maybe makes it seem a little bit easier. But when you make an S corporation election, what happens is you become an employee of the business, and then you also are an investor in the business. And so you pay yourself as a W-2 employee through a payroll processing platform. And then you also get like dividends or owner draws because of the investment that you have as being an owner. So you kind of end up wearing two hats. And the way that you get taxed as a sole proprietorship or a single owner LLC, the equivalent of that is what happens with your payroll. Everything that's coming through to you as a W-2 employee, it's like the taxes might be called something different. It's the same end result in terms of how much. And what that is an extra 15.3% tax on
Mm,
top of the regular federal and state taxes that you're already paying, that
mhm.
you have to pay in addition. So on the S Corp side, what we do is we say, okay, what's your salary going to be? Okay, now everything beyond that is profit. And all of the profit, all the owner draws that you take out of profit do not have that extra 15.3% tax that you're paying on them. So that's why we do it, because we want to take as much as we can from owner draws. So we're not paying that extra tax. But here's the rub. You have to have a reasonable amount of payroll. So like, let's say you have like a $15,000 profit for the year in your business. Well, you're probably not going to reasonably pay an employee $15,000 a year. I mean, unless they were like a part-time something.
Sure.
But like, if you're a full-time stylist, like that's not going to be reasonable. In my experience, as we run these calculations for our clients, I see like $30,000 to $35,000 a year as like the average. Obviously it changes if you go, if you live in San Diego, San Francisco, or New
Right.
York City, like the cost of living makes a difference. There are a lot of factors that go into it. I'm just saying that's the average that I see countrywide. And so I want to see a $20,000 gap between whatever that minimum payroll amount needs to be and your profit. So if you're at a $30,000 payroll, I want to see you have at least a $50,000 profit before we start making the elections, because I need that $20,000 gap so that you can be taking out owner draws without paying that extra money
Mm.
in taxes. So
Mhm.
if you don't have that gap, you're going to have all of the administrative costs of running the S corporation without the tax benefits, which doesn't make any sense. So I always want to make sure we don't jump into S corp before it makes financial sense from a tax perspective. And then I'll also say, I have had stylists come to me and they're like, my accountant said I needed to make at least $100,000 a year before I do S corp, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, we need to get you an S corp so fast, because you're like throwing money away. You're losing like
Yeah.
$10,000 a year if you have $100,000 profit and you're not in an S corp. So it can go both ways, but we don't want to make it too early, and we also don't want to make it too late. Otherwise, we're wasting money in taxes.
Okay, sweet. Let me break this down. So LLC and a sole proprietorship, those are entities, right? So that would be like an incorporation for the business, right? So, but you have to have an LLC in order to file as an S corp. And the S corp filing is a tax filing. Yes?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, so if they're making around, or they start to get close to the $50,000 net profit, they want to start sniffing around with their CPA to say, okay, this may be a time for us to start filing as an S corp. And then when they decide that, the CPA would give them a reasonable compensation, right, for their area. And then they would get paid the reasonable compensation on payroll. And then anything extra or owner's draw, that would be, they would be paid in an owner's draw, and that would be taxed. That's where they save the taxes, correct?
Beautiful. Yep. That's
Okay,
exactly it.
perfect. I say that over and over, so I keep reminding myself of how it works. And when, because I see sometimes with coaching clients, they're like $100,000 net profit and they're not filing as an S corp. And I'm like, hey, I'm not a CPA, but I have learned so much over the years. You need to really talk to your CPA. What do you say to people who have tried to talk to their CPA? Because this has happened and their CPA is like, nah, I don't know if it's the best option for you. How do they navigate that?
Yeah. I would say I would want to know why they're saying that, because what happens is when you have someone who isn't specializing in the beauty industry, they don't know what a reasonable compensation
Mm-hmm.
is. And reasonable compensation is based upon the duties that you're performing within the business, certainly like where you're living in the country and cost of living in that area. And if they're looking at like an attorney, it's like, well, yeah, I mean, attorneys probably needs to be salaried at, 100 grand a year. So they need to be over 100 grand a year. So if they're not looking at the industry specifically, then they probably just aren't aware of what like an average salary is. When I'm telling you 30, 35K is about the average of what I see, it's because we use third-party software that goes in, asks a bunch of questions, and you can kind of run this analysis for yourself. I'll go through the process of it. It's you break out an average week and you go, how do I spend my time? How much is behind the chair? How much is, just like, am I a receptionist or secretary doing like administrative work? Am I, doing social media marketing? You kind of break down how you're spending an average week. And then you go, okay, so, X percent of my time is spent in all these places. And then you go, okay, well, if I were going to hire a stylist in this area, what's like the average hourly rate for that person? If I was going to hire an administrative assistant, what's the average hourly rate for that person? So you kind of look at like, what duties am I performing and how much is like a fair rate that if I were going to put out a job posting that people would actually apply and want to work.
Got
Um,
it.
and then on top of that, you might look at what we call proficiency, but basically how good are you at that thing, which is I have stylists will go through the process and they're like, well, I have been doing my own bookkeeping, but like I'm not very good at it. Okay, so like I'm not going to be like a top dollar like
Right.
bookkeeping rate. I'm going to be like on the lower end of like average because I that's not like my skill set. Um, so that kind of also can play into like lowering what that salary is because if you're doing something that isn't really in your zone of genius, you can attribute a lower salary to that
That
thing.
makes total sense. When can someone file their own S corp? Because someone asked me this, and I was like, I don't think so. Like, can they just go ahead and file an S corp?
I mean, in theory, yeah, because you've got like a software out there like a TurboTax that like they have
Okay.
the forms available. It's not
Hmm.
like it's like paywalled that you
Sure.
can go on the IRS's website and download the forms, technically speaking.
Hmm.
I just don't recommend it
Right.
because there are rules with an S corporation that are more complex. And you can very quickly start doing things incorrectly if you
Sure.
aren't doing it. Um, so it's like, I mean, in theory, you could. I just don't
Right.
recommend.
I think yeah, it just makes me nervous. Like he just seems complicated. Any of that tax IRS stuff, I always like just defer to the CPA. I think it's so important to do that. And, I know again, this stuff can be very overwhelming. And if you have questions, like we want you to be able to reach out. And I know, Michelle, you answer your DMs on Instagram. I always, of course, I live on Instagram. So of course I'll always answer my DMs, but I think it's okay not to know everything. Like you're not a CPA. I'm not a CPA. We're not accountants. That's not what we do. And so I cannot stress this enough, finding the right person is so imperative for your business. And I've talked about this before in my classes, but when I was in such a mess financially the first 5 years of my business, I finally found a CPA that understood my business. And when she filed my taxes for me, she saved me over 5 grand just in that 1 year. And I was like, this is amazing. Like, why didn't anyone tell me this before? So I think finding your person is important. And how do you suggest people go about that? Because I think that comes up a lot too. Like, what should I ask a CPA that I'm interviewing, or where do I find them? It has to be a really good fit. I mean, I always recommend you because you always take care of people, you understand our industry, and you just operate from a space of compassion. And I think that's needed, when you're looking for a CPA. So, what are some questions maybe they can ask?
Yeah. As you were talking, it made me think, sometimes you'll meet people and they'll be like, oh, yeah, I do my own hair. I cut my own hair. I do my
Hmm.
own hair. And you're like, I can tell. Uh, sometimes I feel that way, when people I'll pull up a tax return and I'm like, I can tell
Yeah.
that this was DIY. There's stuff missing. Um, but as far as like finding the right person, I would say it's something that I wouldn't want to rush because as you kind of alluded to, the relationship that you had with your CPA was like a long-term relationship
Hmm.
that you worked with her for a long time. And that's the best. I would say the first year that we have a relationship with a client, we're learning so much about how that client operates. Even with us like being beauty industry specific, there are still
Hmm.
differences between salons and just what people have going on in their lives. So that first year, we're spending a lot of time getting to know them and we learn a lot. So on the client side, once you kind of understand that it kind of takes time to like build that relationship and get that knowing if you're switching accountants every year trying to find the
Hmm.
right person, every year you're losing everything that got built up in that
Sure.
first year of the relationship. Um, So I would say take your time interviewing. Don't rush. Don't be afraid to file an extension on your tax return. There's nothing wrong with filing an extension. If you think you're going to owe, you can make an estimate for how much you think you will owe at that point. But take the time to interview. And just like what Nina was talking about, is this CPA someone who's going to have the heart of a teacher and going to want to explain everything and answer all of your questions? Or are they like let's move along. You're
Speed it
clogging up the
up.
line here.
Speed it up, kid. Hurry up.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say is it is really common in the accounting industry that tax firms will work their employees 60, 70, 80 hours a week during tax season. And when you think about like how good is your work after you've worked 70 hours, like you're not your best self.
Sure.
So when you're hiring someone to do something as sensitive as tax work, I always say done is better than perfect unless it's a tax return. Cause like you actually, it's like one of those things. It's like you actually do need it perfect. Like there isn't really a mess around with like, maybe this or that. It's like, no, there's a right answer. 1 + 1 = 2 on a tax
Yeah.
return, and it does need to be right. So you want to find a place that is not crazy overworking their employees, because you want people who have had a good night's sleep, are at their best, ready to really properly take care of your stuff. And you're not just like another cog in the wheel, just
Mm-hmm.
moving through their system. So that would, and I think when you tie those two things together, people are going to take the time to explain things to you. And also that they're like not overworking staff. They kind of go together, because when people
Sure.
are overworked, then they're not going to take the time to explain anything. And
Right.
so I think those are probably the two biggest things that I would look out for.
Absolutely. And the response time too, I think is so important, because nothing is worse than when you have something pressing and they don't get back to you in a month. It takes a
Yeah.
whole month for someone like that. Like, how long is it going to take for you to respond? Listen, I know I'm not your only client. However, are we talking a couple days? Are we talking a week? Just so I understand what to expect. I think that was very important for me, because I was going through a lot of financial issues and also with the IRS at that time. And I needed her to represent me and take care of these things for me. And so her response time was always very quick. And it was supposed to be that way to make me feel better, and I think that's part of the job sometimes. And not that everyone needs a CPA because they're in financial duress or they're having issues or they're in, debt with the IRS like I was. But I think just regular response time, like what does that look like? You don't want to be waiting for a month to have someone respond. So this was so informative. And like I said, we've had these conversations so many times, but I always just find myself learning more and more. And I just want to thank you, because you've done so much for our industry, and it seemed like you appeared all of a sudden during COVID or right before COVID. And you were so helpful in aiding everyone that was going through such a really, really rough time. And so, this was so nice to chat with you. And I just thank you so much for your knowledge. I love our friendship. Where can people find you? I know you have a bookkeeping course that's coming up. Give them all the deets so they can find you and reach out.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Nina. I really do treasure our friendship, and I have so much respect for everything that you do for the industry.
Oh, thank you.
If people want to find me, my Instagram is the best place, at Small Business CPA. Feel free to slide into my DMs. I share a lot of free resources and good information there. If I post a new blog, I talk about it on my Instagram. So that's the best place.
Perfect. And your course is called
Beauty bookkeeping.
Yes.
Yes. And so beauty bookkeeping is about making sure that you understand how to get your books done so that you can pay yourself. And, we were talking about that's usually the problem that people have. It's like when I say, oh, you need to do your bookkeeping, it's like, oh, that doesn't sound very sexy. That's like not something I'm like all
Right.
that excited to do. But when you understand that the purpose of doing it is so that you can pay yourself, it's all of a sudden like, okay, well, now there's a purpose here. I'm
Right.
all about paying myself. Let's figure out how to get this done. But it is a whole new skill set. So that's what that course is for, specifically for beauty professionals.
Love it. Love, love, love. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you, everyone that has been tuning in. I appreciate your support so much, and I will see you next time. Thank you.